Thanks so much for tuning in to the Sustainable Brown Girl YouTube channel. This show exists to provide representation for women of color within the environmental space, to share their stories, and to inspire all to be more eco-friendly every day. I'm your host, Ariel Green. This is where you can see all of the full video podcast episodes. So be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. Also, go follow us on Instagram at Sustainable Brown Girl. Enjoy! Today's featured Sustainable Brown Girl is Anya Sastry, a climate activist, filmmaker, and student. She produced a documentary titled Frontliners that highlights environmental injustice from the perspective of the less privileged. Anya is the former National Outreach Director for the U.S. Youth Climate Strike and a contributor for the book United We Are Unstoppable: 60 Inspiring Young People Saving Our World by Akshat Rathi. Thank you so much for joining us today, Anya.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes. So let's go way back to when Anya was just a little girl growing up. Tell us how you became interested in sustainability.
Yeah, of course. So the moment at which I really pinpoint um, my early involvement in this movement, was back in 2018. I was 16 years old, and in 2018, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced their influential 2018 report detailing that we only have like a certain number of years left to take concrete climate action. And at that time, that number was 12. And I remember seeing that on headlines everywhere, newspaper articles, news channels, on TV. This number, 12 years, was plastered everywhere. And I think at that point, I truly realized that the the climate crisis and climate change is not just as simple as reduce, reuse, recycle. It's an institutionalized crisis that stems from organizations and power structures that have existed for centuries at this point. And it's something that's going to take a global effort to overcome. Um, and so at that point, I think other kids my age were also having that realization of, you know, people in older generations are not putting in effort into solving and combating this global crisis. But this is our future. And, you know, as citizens of this world, we have an obligation, a duty to, respond and to combat that fight or to combat that crisis. And so um, at that point, a few of us, there's this, activist community on social media like Instagram. And a few of us started like communicating through Instagram DMs and messaging and trying to brainstorm what we could do. And at that point, it was like a handful of us, and we started talking about a national movement of strikes.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of leads into the U.S. Youth Climate Strike, and the work that I did. But yeah, that was my foundation with getting more involved in sustainability and overall thinking about how I can fight against the climate crisis. Was that 2018 IPCC report, and the kind of jarring message that it sent in terms of how little time we have left to fight back.
Right, exactly. So when you read that report or you watched it or whatever, I'm assuming that obviously it scared you into wanting to
Mhm.
take some type of action. When I was growing up, I'm a few years older than you, I'm sure, but we learned about, what was it called, global warming back then. But it was kind of like, oh, it's not that serious. But now, with younger people growing up, it's more of an immediate thing. It's in the media much more,
Mhm.
so do you feel like as a young person growing up, and working with other young people in the climate strike, it's like this is going to affect us, like this lifetime, like we're still going to be young when the temperatures are rising and we can really see it.
Oh, 100%. And I
Yeah.
think for a lot of people, it's easy to not see it as current and immediate because right now what we're seeing, are all these drastic effects happening to marginalized communities that a lot of us aren't a part of. And so it's easy to ignore it. But when you take an intersectional approach to sustainability, you see that there are, African American communities, there are Indigenous communities, there are Latinx communities across the United States, and then there are international communities that are experiencing firsthand currently the drastic effects of this climate crisis, with things like pollution and polluted waterways and public health crises and that kind of thing.
Right.
So I'm definitely in tune to the fact, and I think a lot of other youth are as well, that this is a current issue in the immediate future, in the now, and we can't waste any time with not taking action.
Absolutely. So tell me more about the youth climate strike. What is it, and what was your role as the national outreach director?
Yeah, so like I said, a group of us were brainstorming like what we could do to garner attention for the climate crisis. And we thought of the idea of doing these coordinated strikes across the nation,
Mhm.
in every state, even in some US territories, where kids, and anyone really across the nation would go on strike from probably their school, like their place of work, and just take a day to um, focus on the climate crisis and its issues and its dangers so that it could bring more general awareness to the broader population. And our goal with that was to get, media attention, to get national attention and draw attention to this issue. So we spent a few months planning and reaching out and organizing grassroots groups within all of these states and territories and getting people plugged in on the ground, in their communities to organize these strikes. And on March 15th, 2019, we had our first strike, US strike. And it was amazing. I was co leading the strike in Chicago for Illinois. And I remember um, we had hundreds of people out there. I would say
Wow.
close to 1,000, maybe. Yeah. Just marching the streets of Chicago. And it was such a powerful moment, where I felt like we were able to kind of regain control of the narrative of the
Mm,
climate crisis, and really share to the broader community how scared and frightened, our generation is, regarding this issue.
right.
And it really took off from there, to be honest. Once we got that national attention of kids leaving school and marching in the streets on that day, we were quickly, planning the next strike. And that all kind of eventually led up to the international strike, in on September 20th. And that, I think, was a monumental day because it was one of, if not the largest human gatherings in history, where we were able to coordinate with people across the globe
Wow.
to, bring people out, onto the streets all around the world advocating for climate action. I was in New York for that strike, and there were hundreds of thousands of people.
Wow.
And we had like millions of people in the US striking. And it was just truly a grassroots powered movement from the beginning. And I think that's what adds so much power to it. I'm someone who strongly believes in power of the people, and
Mhm.
the fact that we as people have this inherent power that we have to utilize to achieve change. And I think I really saw that in these strikes and then in the final international strike.
Yes, that's so amazing that you were able to get so many people together across the world to, have this strike. That's incredible. So, what do you think was the response to the strike, like from the media, from people in power? How did they respond?
I think from the media, they definitely, were focused on us.
Hmm.
We had a lot of press moments where, News reporters, TV outlets wanted to get us, in their studios and have us share their message. Um, what's interesting with the people in power is that, at the time, what I've noticed is that it's a lot of words and not a lot of
Oh
actions,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So, you know, when us youth, we were, going to their congressional offices, we were trying to have conversations. It was really easy for them to placate us with words of, we're going to try and like get this bill in here. We're,
Hmm.
with local politicians too, or we're going to make local changes to the community. Um, Even as far as like Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, like we're trying as hard as we can.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, what I've realized is that they make a lot of empty promises, but something about Gen Z is that we are, if you make us a promise, we're going to follow up with that
Oh
time and
yeah.
time again. We're not just going to let you, say these words and then do nothing about it. So what I really appreciate about my generation is that we are coming back time and time again and we're not giving up the fight. This is a long-term fight and it's something that you have to be committed to. It has to be sustainable. It's not just a one and done, because unfortunately, um, the people that are in power aren't just going to listen to us after one try and implement all the changes that we need. It's something that we have to keep fighting for, keep going back in and talking to them about. And so it's been like years long in the making. People are still doing hard, local, regional, national work to this day. And, hopefully we can get to a point where we have these young people getting into positions of power eventually so that we can make, oh, apologies, let me just turn off my notifications, so that we can get that change implemented into the actual structures of our system and our nation and our globe.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you about Gen Z, how you guys are so persistent. When I was the big thing when I was coming up, I mean I said coming up, but like one of the big like social activist things was Occupy Wall Street for me. And
Yes.
so, yeah. And so, like that was a big millennial led thing. And we stuck with that for a few years, but it just kind of fizzled out, you know.
Hmm.
But I definitely see how much work Gen Z is putting into combating the climate change issue and
Hmm.
holding representatives and corporations responsible. And I can only imagine that it's just going to keep growing. So,
Right.
with that being said, what are some ways that you would suggest young people to get involved?
I think the number one thing that I would suggest to anyone, especially young people, is to get plugged into grassroots movements. I mean, whether you realize it or not, every local community has some kind of grassroots sustainable movement working to combat some local issue. Like I said, whether it's like pollution, or public health, especially in bigger American cities, there are marginalized communities who are doing incredibly hard work. And oftentimes their voices are silenced and forgotten and ignored because of their ethnicity, because of their background. Um, so what I really suggest is people, doing the work, doing the research, finding these groups. And what the important thing is not just inserting yourself into that group, into that organization, but rather, reaching out to them, contacting them, asking to learn from them, and asking them, what can I do to help you? What can I do to amplify your voice? What can I do to support you, to empower you in your fight, to create change in your community? Because they have these fights that have been going on for decades now, and they have their philosophies and their structures of grassroots movements, that I think we have to honor. So that's the main thing that I would suggest is getting plugged into those organizations, and really seeing how you can help, and support their fight.
Yes, those are great tips. Another way that I've seen you be a climate activist is through your documentary, Frontliners. So
Mhm.
tell us more about that.
Yeah, so Frontliners was born out of a fellowship that I received through my high school, and I'm a very creative person. I love media work of all kinds. I love photography. I love videography, and I also knew that I wanted to be able to use my positions and my space in the climate movement to help
Mhm.
spread the message of other people and these marginalized groups that are oftentimes ignored or silenced. Um, so, through this fellowship that I received through my high school, I was thinking, how can I combine both my creative, passions with my with climate action and with my desire to help out these communities? And that's where Frontliners came to be. And Frontliners is a documentary that explores environmental injustice and cases of environmental injustice. So it's a two-part documentary. In the first part, um, we we go to northern Minnesota, where we sit down and talk with Indigenous grassroots activists in northern Minnesota from the Ojibwe tribe. Um, and who have been in this decades long fight against the Line 3 pipeline. And the Line 3 pipeline is a pipeline that would absolutely tear apart Minnesota's waterways. And this indigenous tribe, that's their lifeline.
Mm.
They for forever they've worked with the waterways, they've worked with the ecosystem that inhabits northern Minnesota, and this tar sands oil pipeline threatens to destroy all of that and to completely tarnish that area of Minnesota just simply for profit, for monetary gain. Um, and so the summer of 2019, I drove to northern Minnesota and I had the opportunity to in person sit and, have conversations with these activists and organizers. And I also had the opportunity to speak with youth organizers in Minnesota who are plugged into other grassroots movements and really just explore the issue of the Line 3 pipeline. And then the second part of the documentary is focused on a Latinx community in inner city Chicago. Um, and with that segment, I was able to meet with a grassroots organization in that community called El Viejo, and they have for years been fighting pollution and public health issues in inner city Chicago in terms of the fact that because they're a Latinx community, Chicago has felt that it was okay to have all the trucks pass through their community or have all the factories placed like across the street from the residential spaces, or to
Wow.
completely eradicate all the green spaces and community spaces for the use of factories and machinery and that kind of thing. And their residents are getting cancer from these chemicals and pollutants, and they're getting all these public health problems, and their kids are being raised on these chemicals in their schools and all this kind of these things. And so I was able to, get plugged into that community group and talk with the older, more established members, but also the youth community members that they're training in their
Mhm.
grassroots ways. And so the film just really explores two very different instances of environmental injustice, but establishes common themes of how these marginalized groups are constantly facing institutionalized discrimination and resistance from these power structures. But it's just incredible how they're there time and time again at the front lines, standing up for their rights, for their people, for their futures.
Yes. Wow, that's so incredible that you were able to go to these two places and share their stories. I was watching the documentary and how you were saying that the pipeline would run through their water source. And also
Mhm.
too, wasn't that tribe in they grow rice, right? So that would
Yes.
also affect their food.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then with the Latinx community, with the pollution, all that, it was really affecting the children and the schools too.
Mhm.
So it's just so frustrating,
Yeah.
that communities of color are so, at the back of people's minds, when it comes to
Mhm.
environmental racism and, just corporate pollution. It's awful. So you know, there's only so much that we can do, of course, but what do you think is the best thing that people can do to, like maybe spread the word or to try to, convince corporations to, stop doing this?
Yeah, I would say what we can start off with doing is putting an incredible amount of pressure
Yeah.
on the people in power and these organizations that continue to commit these atrocities against these communities. For example, with the two specific communities that I talk about in my documentary, um, putting pressure on local Minnesota government, with the governor of Minnesota, with local structures of power, because what people don't realize is that even though they're local, they have an incredible amount of power that affects the daily lives of people in that community. So putting pressure on them, calling their offices, sending letters, even if possible, going in person and just forcing them to have conversations. Because when you show up time and time again, and have them understand that you're not going away anytime soon, like then they're
Mhm.
going to, reciprocate and be open to having these conversations. With regards to the situation in Chicago, getting in contact with the local EPA offices and agents, speaking with Chicago politicians who directly have a hand in which parts of the city get community green spaces, which
Mhm.
parts of the city get more funding than others, which parts of the city have these industrial zones running through them.
Right.
They all have, decision power in that. So getting, connected with these people, going to their offices, calling them, it's a really it has to be a consistent fight. And that's, what I said earlier. It's not
Mhm.
something that can be a one and done. You have to be in it for the long term, while at the same time also what I think is important is, being able to make sure that you can be there for the long term. Don't
Mhm.
burn yourself out. Don't go, completely hard for a month and then just like back out of the fight for the next 6 months. It's a sustained thing. And you have to make sure to, treat yourself with care and recognize when you can take a more active role and when you need to take a step back to, recharge, but because ultimately it is a long-term committed fight.
Absolutely. Yes, it is.
Mhm.
So, you are currently a student. So, what
Yes.
are your goals for, your education and your career?
Yeah, so I'm currently a sophomore at Tulane University in New Orleans. I'm getting my Bachelor of Arts in International Relations and my Bachelor of Science and Management in Finance.
Nice.
So I'm, getting both this theoretical, global political education while also learning these hard technical skills of finance. And what I hope to do and how I hope to really intersect that in education with my goals of climate action, is to, get involved with policymaking and, international politics on a global level. And what I think is such a crucial aspect of the climate crisis movement is finance.
Mm,
It really ultimately all comes down to financing and how people in power want to allocate their funds to combating this crisis or to not combating it, which has been the policy
right.
for the past however many decades. But I want to be able to use my financial education to say it is possible to invest early and now into combating the climate crisis so that we're not, paying an exorbitant amount of money fighting the effects later.
Mm.
Um, and really getting involved on the international level with international policymakers and global networks, and to be able to figure that out, I think would be a really cool opportunity to intersect my passions for climate action with my education.
Yes. I love that you're coming at it from a different perspective because I know, or I tend to see a lot of people majoring like in environmental science or something like that. But
Mhm.
I like the perspective that you're taking from a finance perspective because at the IPCC from this past year, money was a big talk about it.
Yeah,
So
right.
we know that it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of investing to build green infrastructure,
Mhm.
especially in developing countries.
Right. Right.
So yeah, so that's so important. I absolutely love that.
Thank you.
Yes. So is there anything else on your radar coming up? Are you working on anything?
So, as part of this program, this dual degree program that I'm in at my school, I spend my entire junior year of university abroad, which
Hmm.
is very cool. And hopefully, I'll be able to spend my first semester in Quito, Ecuador. I am learning Spanish, so my entire study abroad year will be focused in Spanish speaking countries.
Nice.
So what I'm hoping with, living in Quito, Ecuador for, 5, 6 months is to get plugged into local indigenous groups who are in the Amazon, in the Amazonian area, and who are, who have these really, um, really traditional like systems and styles of living that honor the earth. I feel like there's so much to learn from them and the ways in which they um, combat these institutionalized power structures that just seek to destroy the earth for the sake of monetary gain. And yeah, I mean, Ecuador is such a beautiful country with such a beautiful, environmental system and terrain. And
Yeah.
I really can't wait to, at the tail end of this year, go there and learn from them and hopefully be able to, you know, learn these systems and transfer them to, the United States and other places of the world.
Yeah. Wow. I would love to see another documentary from you about that.
Yeah, yeah, that would be really cool.
Right. Well, this is so amazing. It's been really great talking to you and learning from you and hearing your perspective and just seeing that you are on the path to create so much change and inspire other people to do the same.
Thank you.
So, yes, please tell us now, what does being a sustainable brown girl mean to you?
Being a sustainable brown girl to me means, I think, ultimately making space for people who look like me
Mhm.
and who share the same background as me. Um, just honestly, women of color in general. I think oftentimes um, we tend to get shut out of this movement because there are a lot of, privileged individuals who get to be at the front and who are speaking the loudest and who have the power and the platform to amplify their voice. But as a sustainable brown girl who's involved in this movement, I as I'm, progressing through these roles and, getting access to more of these spaces, my goal is to, create this channel through which more women of color, more brown girls can get involved and get access to these spaces and communities where they can implement change. Because there's so many of us who have such brilliant ideas and who have such passion and commitment to creating a better world and making our communities a better space for everyone living in it currently and for the people who will inhabit it in the future. And I think first and foremost, um, my role as a sustainable brown girl is to um, create more space for others who are like me.
Yes, yes, and you are definitely doing that. So, thank you so much for joining us today. And please let everyone know where they can find you online and how they can support you.
Yeah, so you can find me online on Instagram. My handle is at Anya Sastry. And if you would like to watch the documentary that I made, my website is anyasastry.com, and you can do the /frontliners to go straight to the documentary. It would be amazing if you would watch it. And yeah, that's where you can find me online. Thank you so much for having me. It was so nice to sit down and chat and discuss.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. So please go follow Anya. Go watch her documentary. It's really great, eye opening, and you'll learn a lot. So thanks again. Don't leave just yet. Click here to hear from another sustainable brown girl, or click here to watch the full playlist from this season.